Good morning. It's good to be with you again. Yesterday, we talked about macro level issues, and this is going to be a big shift to the micro. And I think that this is where we build our legacies. This is where we can have the greatest impact if you're talking about a social, political, cultural, spiritual impact. It is in the minutia of our life, the details, the things that we put in motion every day that, again, as I suggested yesterday, in aggregate, make for the building of our legacy. I want to suggest also that there is something that stands in the way of that in our very busy lives, and that is what some have described as the tyranny of the urgent. We have so many things that fill every minute of our day, every day of our week, and there's very little time to stop and reflect. And I think that what we lose in that is something very, very significant, and the consequences are very, very severe. In the olden days, you had the peripatetic life, the walkabout life. You walked everywhere. And there was a lot of time to think and reflect and listen. And I think that what we have today, instead of the peripatetic life, is the modern day hectic life. And we go and we go and we go, and then we collapse at the end of the day and are grateful for all the things that were done, but very rarely are those thin spaces in time where we rest, where we listen, where we dream. And I think this is where we also fail to see what is possible in terms of God's shaping all of the potentialities that He's given us. In other words, there's no time to see the future. I had an interesting conversation with Dr. William Welty last night, and it was a good reminder that Luther said, if the Lord's coming back tomorrow, I'm going to plant a tree in the morning. And there's this idea that there is the tomorrows that we don't know of yet, and we live into those. And I think that's very important as you cast a vision for your children, for your grandchildren, of what life is, of what an abundant life is here and now. So The Intentional Family is the title of my book, Reverse Engineering a Legacy from Finish to Start. It's also our topic today. And I have to be honest, I don't know that I'm qualified for this particular topic. The things that I think might have some bearing on speaking to being intentional and raising a family and reverse engineering a legacy. I am a son. I'm also a father. I knew one of my grandfathers. We probably spent time together a maximum of 6 times in my life. I have children, and I can imagine the future. And these are things that, prayerfully considered, I think go into ultimately creating a context that is soul transforming, life transforming, full of vision, and inspirational to my children as giving them a redemptive hope and a view to a joyful life. And again, I hope that this is something that is vision cast for future generations of McAlvanys. David Mitchell says, our lives are not our own. We are bound to others, past and present, and by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future. Which is to suggest that our choices are not made in a vacuum, and they directly impact not only our lives, but all of the lives around us. Jeremiah says in chapter 10, verse 23, Lord, I know that people's lives are not their own. How we live our lives is either a blessing to others in terms of the legacy blessing that it creates, or it just adds burdensome baggage that they carry, that we carry. In other words, our choices have implications into the future. So after 2 generations and a combined 50 years, a half century in the business of wealth management, there are some lessons that I think are crystal clear. 50 years and thousands of families that I've watched my father consult with, that I've consulted with, and I'll tell you, only on rare occasions are resources stewarded well intergenerationally. Money is more often than not a source of conflict, in part, I suppose, because the most neglected resource is to the outsider fairly obvious. It's the heart. The heart of each individual in the family, the heart of the family itself. When you tend to those things, it opens the door for a much broader treatment of family legacy, and I think that's sorely needed. We see wealth management as the management of a single resource, with many more in a successful legacy plan being treated very, very carefully. So a wider range of resources is what I'm suggesting has to be stewarded. Our lives do touch at least 4 generations. You have multi-generational inputs. Grandparents are very significant. Great-grandparents are very significant. And there's 2 aspects to this. There is the presence aspect. Presence is very impactful. Your presence in someone's life is very, very important. But your absence is impactful as well. It was Paul Vitz, a Christian psychologist at New York University, who has written a case for the absence of fathers or a father substitute as being the critical element in the lives of your most prominent atheists. My point is that absence of any generation leaves its mark. One generation can set in motion something that the next generation experiences as a blessing as that second or the third or the fourth generation in a line of continuity. And to see that continuity broken because of absence is very critical. John Adams says, "I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics, philosophy, geography, natural history, and naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry." No one really studies porcelain anymore. What this means is that one generation enables the next to go further. My father and mother decided to follow Jesus as adults. Their children as children. Each generation gleans and benefits from a refinement, a distillation, and allowing the next generation to see these things, frankly, some things that were unseen to the previous generation. It is this notion of standing on the shoulders of giants. When you stand on the shoulders of giants, you see a different horizon. You see a different horizon. And I think this is the opportunity found in an intentional family. What is an intentional family? What is reverse engineering? Let's look at a couple of definitions just so that we're all on the same page. What are your highest ideals? Think about this. What are your highest ideals? What are your greatest aspirations? What are your biggest hopes? What are your grandest dreams? Tie these into the matters of the heart, matters of the mind, your soul, your body. I guess what I'm asking is this. If you are made in the image of God, and I think we take that seriously, don't we? If we're made in the image of God, what are our capacities? What are our capacities? And does the ideal, aspiration, hopes, or dreams, do those things line up with the choices that we're making every day? What are you capable of? What are you capable of? And if you can identify what you're capable of, are you moving towards that? Now we're talking about something that is less ideal and certainly more mundane, because to arrive at a long-term trajectory, to arrive at those long-term goals, it's something that will require discipline and dedication, and sometimes it's just not fun. In the office, I asked who would like to join me in a competitive endeavor. We're going to run a small triathlon this next June, and I thought 1 or 2 in the office would take me up on it. 21 people in our office are going to do this triathlon next June, and what they're finding, and what I'm finding too, is that there's a lot of mundane, difficult, boring training that goes into being able to ultimately run the race. And I can tell you, staring at a black line on the bottom of the pool is not my idea of a fun time. At the end of a mile, I only wish one thing. I wish I could whistle underwater. It's incredibly boring, but the cumulative, again, what we suggested yesterday, the aggregate benefit of all those small choices is that by next June 6th, I should be ready. I should be ready to run the race. Intentionality is where imagination meets redemption and hope as we pray for God to open our eyes to His vision of human flourishing for our family. What is your vision? Is it big enough? Are you determined to put it in motion and keep it in motion? Intentionality is the act of developing a self-conscious and deliberate vision for the spiritual, for the intellectual, for the financial, for the cultural legacy of your family. Intentionality is what it takes to say, I want to be there. I'm going to do that. I am going to take deliberate steps towards that end. Now, legacy is something that everyone receives. Everyone receives a legacy, and everyone is now, whether you know it or not, crafting a legacy. It is an inescapable concept. Legacy is an inescapable concept. We may choose to invest in our legacy, or we may choose to neglect it. But either way, you and I will leave a legacy to our children's children. So what is it? Is it one of love? Is it one of respect, encouragement, dignity, forgiveness, grace? Or is it one that, unfortunately, in those moments of inattention, include rage, belittlement, disrespect, gracelessness? There is a physical, tangible resource, and that's the easiest for us to wrap our minds around in terms of a legacy that we leave. But it's also one of these other categories, blessings that are beyond mere physical resources, and I think they have to be thoughtfully tended to. The categories that you can put these into in terms of your legacy are the spiritual, the cultural. What I mean by cultural, what are the things that you do as a family that define you as uniquely a Smith, a Johnson, a McAlvany? What are the things that define your family time and your family life together? I think as you begin to look at your legacy and look at what you want it to be, this is your starting point. The most practical starting point is, have you taken an inventory, a legacy inventory? Have you taken an accounting for what you have already received? There's a tremendous amount of gratefulness, I think, that is necessary for you to successfully implement your own vision of legacy. And that gratefulness comes from reflecting on what you have. What you have, what you have received, from whom you have received it. Who are the people in your life that have left a significant mark? Was it a grandfather? Was it an uncle? Was it a teacher? Was it a football coach? Was it Chuck? Who was it that left a significant mark in your life? From whom did you receive it? What do you have? What do you lack? The areas where you received a zero balance, that is as much an inheritance as where you are a second or third generation recipient of blessing. Does that make sense? Take an accounting of what you have. Now, what do you wish to leave? What do you want to create? You may find that as you imagine, that you let your mind wander to the people that you've encountered who represent greatness. I don't know who those are in your life, but if you have ever encountered greatness, greatness in what respect? Were they successful businessmen? Were they successful prayer warriors? Were they, in what aspect of their life would you say, I have complete and total respect for them, I just wish that I could be like them? Well, as you are casting your vision and creating a notion of what you want to leave as a legacy, I would suggest that you inform that by your direct encounters with people who you say, if I could be a little bit more like that, if I could engender that within our family context, that would be a legacy I desire to leave. On the financial side, Jim Rogers is a guy who worked with the Quantum Fund. The Quantum Fund was George Soros's hedge fund, and he retired in his 30s. Smart guy. I had many conversations with him. He's joined us on our weekly commentary a number of times. He wrote a book in the 80s called The Investment Biker, and it's a fascinating book about his travels around the world on a BMW motorcycle. I happen to like BMW motorcycles. I happen to like traveling. I happen to like investing, and it's a book that's perfectly suited for me. You might consider reading it. But it's interesting because he takes this notion of reverse engineering and he applies it to something very practical in a course that he taught at Columbia University on investing. He said, now, if you see something that has worked, where an investment theme played out just like this, and it worked, but you find that you didn't participate in it, the question is, how do you see those precursor events which would have been indicators, which would have been signals to you of what to do and when to do it? His process is very similar in terms of reverse engineering. Find success, see what made it work, and look for those patterns to see if those patterns can also be employed again. So Jim Rogers, I think, is just one example of how to reverse engineer a legacy. But beyond that, I mean, again, we have these spiritual elements, the cultural elements, the intellectual elements, the financial elements. All of these factor into the legacy that you leave. And by the way, you can, if you don't make an effort, simply leave a zero balance. You can leave a zero balance. Legacy is far more than assets on a balance sheet. Legacy is our life message. It is the sum of the values and the vision that we leave to others. It is our approach to money. It is our approach to property and to business and to culture and to faith and to identity and virtue. These are the elements of legacy which we receive. These are the elements of legacy that we develop and that we ultimately bequeath to others. The pains you experienced, these are important. The truths that you stood for, these are important. The truths that you fought for, these are important. What you worked for, what you waited for, all of this is the stuff of legacy. The problem of three generations is captured in virtually every culture with its own phrase. It's not uncommon, in fact, it is most common, that whatever legacy has been created, if it's a financial legacy, this phrase, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, suggests that there is a founder generation, and that founder generation breaks ground, accumulates, succeeds, but then by the third generation, that wealth that had been created has been squandered. And I think you find this also in the spiritual, where you may have one generation that is so deeply committed to Christ, but by the second or third generation, something has slipped, something is different. Something was not replicated. Something within the family culture was not cultivated that allowed for those same values to be transmitted from one generation to the next. You can blame it on public schools, you can blame it on colleges and universities, you can blame it on a number of externalities, but I would suggest to you that there is a compelling vision which, if properly cast, goes beyond all those external threats and allows for continuity of vision and continuity of legacy. But this problem of three generations is common throughout the world. Clogs to clogs is the way it's said in the Netherlands. Rice paddy to rice paddy. You rise up out of one, move into industry, and by the third generation, you're back to the rice paddy. Stalls to stars to stalls. Something's not replicated, something falls between the cracks, or perhaps it's the experience of the second or third generation that does not include the same tensions, the same risks, the same anxieties, and the other factors which parents might, at a very existential level, prefer to shield their children from. You want to give them a better life. And yet it's the lessons which end up being different, and those future generations are also different by the lack of those same lessons which were hard fought and hard won by you in your own life. So the problem, why do legacies fail? Well, we could make a list of probably 150, and it still wouldn't exhaust all the reasons why legacies fail. Many reasons exist, but I think the greatest of them is broken relationships. I think as you look at legacy failure from one generation to the next, in any of those categories, I think you're dealing with broken relationships. Broken relationships, more than broken bank accounts, are the ruin of family legacy. A reading of 1 Corinthians 13 might recall to mind the specific missing ingredients in a relationship that really represent the heart of the matter. But you take any one of those elements out, and there's room for broken relationship. Being tender, being kind, being patient, being gentle. These are all the things that in the context of family life, even in the context of business life, you can find room for misunderstanding, miscommunication, and then an exacerbation of that trend to where what you have in the end is a broken relationship, and ultimately the squandered possibility of legacy. So the heart of the problem, I would suggest, is broken relationships. There really is no topic that is outside the context of your legacy and what you bring into transmitting your legacy from one generation to the next. We're talking about the conversations at breakfast that you have with your children, your grandchildren, the conversations that you have at dinner time. We're talking about the books that you read, the ideas that you think about, that you discuss. We're talking about the quirks of each family member which endear them to you, the language that you use, the laughter that you share, the dreams that you have, the aspirations which you regularly discuss with those who are closest to you, the regular haunts that you go to. I talked to my brother yesterday. He's working on his pilot's license in Redding, California. He's taking a brief reprieve from his life in Indonesia. He and his wife and 3 children live in Indonesia. And he said, "Dave, I'm doing my first cross country 2 weeks from now. Guess where I'm going? Southern California. Can you guess?" Well, we have a regular haunt in Southern California. It's called the Crab Cooker. The Crab Cooker is in Newport Beach. I've driven from San Francisco to Newport Beach with my dad just to eat at the Crab Cooker because it's one of our favorite family haunts. There's so much, I can't tell you why, but there is so much value in the time that we've spent there, the conversations. We eat on paper plates and use plastic forks, but somehow this is a part of our family legacy. Everything matters because everything was designed to matter. There are no areas of neutrality in your life when it comes to legacy. Perseverance, I think, is something that is part of what makes legacy possible. Anything worthwhile in life has a cost. And in this case, it includes endurance, it includes commitment, and it includes a willingness to back up and try again. My daughter is learning to ski. She's 4 years old. And we repeat this phrase over and over again before we hit the ski slopes every Saturday morning in wintertime. What happens when you fall down, Tess? Well, we get back up again. And this is something that is not only for the ski slopes, but it's for all of life. Legacy perseverance and endurance is a state of mind. What you are committed to, what you desire, what you aspire to, these are things that need to be repeated over and over again, reviewed, rehearsed. What are the values that you continue to pursue? Because when you fall down, will you get back up again? Rebirth, I think, is something important to touch on. I do in the book. Legacy rebirth. When tragedy occurs, when someone in your family dies, when there is a broken marriage or an absentee father, or again, the death of a loved one, financial ruin, moral failure, personal and familial tragedy, these are not the destructive elements to a legacy. These are opportunities for grace. These are opportunities for mercy. These are opportunities for rebirth. These are what I describe as disturbance. And for the crafting of a successful legacy, I think your family needs to be well prepared for disturbance, because anyone who's been around understands that life is full of disturbance. Things don't always go as planned. And we can whine about it, we can cry about it, we can make excuses on the basis of what didn't go quite right, or we can seek rebirth, redemption, mercy, and grace, and allow those circumstances to draw our families close together. So it is the tender care of those circumstances which I think offers a profound opportunity to practice what, quite frankly, is very often preached within the Christian church, but more rarely lived, which is redemption. The case for redemptive ethics, this is, again, seeking restoration. It is the mending of torn nets. Do you remember where it describes the process of being made ready to become a fisher of men? I want to make you fishers of men. The first thing that happens in the course of being prepared to be a fisher of men is that your nets are mended. My net is torn. My net is full of holes. If I look at the state of my soul and take an honest appraisal, whether it was 20 years ago or 2 days ago, I recognize that there is still a redemptive process occurring. There is still a healing process occurring, and my nets are being mended. And as they are mended, I can be a fisher of men. The case for redemptive ethics, this is how grace saves a family legacy. Without grace, without the daily encounter of grace, in the context of our frailty, in the context of our failures, I think we will short-circuit the pursuit of our legacy objectives. We'll lose the heart of those involved, and I think when you lose the heart of those involved, you have lost the legacy that you wanted. My story you'll get to read about in brief in the book, Intentional Families. I have to be honest with you, it's been very difficult for me to think of actually pushing the button and publishing the whole thing. It's a very personal look at legacy. It's information that, frankly, some of my best friends I've never even talked to about. But in the context of writing the book, it had to do more with codifying what was important for my 9-year-old, my 6-year-old, my 4-year-old, my 18-month-old, to say, I've got one crack at this. Have I thought through every element? They're growing fast, and they're going to be out of the house before I know it. This time frame is almost done. I've got one shot at it. And again, I don't know that I'm an expert in the field. I just know that as a father, I'm making a best effort. My life, as you'll find in the book, is a metaphor of prodigality. I ran away when I was a young man, and then was sent away, and found myself on a fine February day digging feed troughs, 55-gallon drums, split and welded together out of pig slop, to drag them down to a very wintry cold stream, to clean them out by hand and return them to the pig pen to feed the swine. Something had gone wrong with our family plan, something had gone wrong with my plan. I didn't know exactly how I ended up there, but it is a part of my story of redemption. It is a part of our family legacy in terms of there being an allowance for grace and mercy. And I found redemption at a diner, at a Waffle House. It was a point of new beginning, and it marked, for me, my first real encounter with grace. I knew that what I had done to be sitting across the table from my dad, somehow the Waffle House was the place where we would go to have serious discussions. Whenever I got in trouble, we found ourselves at a Waffle House. So I knew that I was in big trouble. And I knew what I had done. I knew more details than my dad did. In fact, he just asked me in a blanket statement, what happened? And I thought that he knew something, and I knew the parties involved were not the most honest characters. So I stepped out and just spilled the beans, told him every detail. And I knew that in the context of telling him every detail that I had broken every rule in the book, and that just as I had been sent away, I would be sent away again. I knew that this was terminal in some sense. And we sat across the table from each other, and through his tears, he simply said, "I forgive you." And my experience of grace in that encounter changed my life. I remember sitting there in that chair thinking to myself, everything will be different. Everything will be different. I had, in a flash of imagination, the last 4 or 5 years of my life played in a very short clip, and I thought, what a waste. Now, as it turns out, it was not a waste. But I felt an urgency in that moment to make up for lost time, to change course, to turn the different direction, metanoeo, turn and go the other way. The case for redemptive ethics, how grace can save a family legacy. Well, redemptive ethics, this is a mindset. This is an ethic that you can adopt within your family that looks for, in the context of things that have failed, of things that have fallen apart, ways of patching it together again, ways of allowing God's grace and love to be expressed and to heal. It depends on non-contingent relationships, it depends on a deep commitment, and it depends on humility. C.S. Lewis says that to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. I've been forgiven, but sometimes we find within the church this sort of toxic tone of, you on the other hand are unforgivable. I've been forgiven, but when someone does something wrong in the context of the church, how are they treated? How are they treated? They shoot their wounded. You're exactly right. They shoot their wounded. No one actually says, you, on the other hand, are unforgivable. But as I look around, that is the graceless ethos of brokenness that has forgotten itself. So there's 3 elements. Non-contingent relationships. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. If you recall, our salvation was not conditional on our thinking and acting rightly and then being saved. God's love extends to us to this day, and guess what? It continues to reach around our imperfections. Love is not conditioned on outcomes. I learned something very important from my father growing up, and it was that I am his son, that even if we argued and debated over ideas were not the same thing as the person in the context of that discussion and debate. And he communicated to me over and over again as we would discuss things, whether it was a social issue, a political issue, a theological issue, that relationship was not at stake. And relationship was not conditioned on my agreeing with him or my doing exactly what he wanted. Relationship is. Relationship is, that phrase to me captures the deep commitment that my father had to relationship, what I learned about it from him. From a child to a parent, I think deep commitment runs in a parallel track with great appreciation and gratefulness. That's what a child, I think, can feel for all that a parent provides. From a parent to a child, it's reflected in our Heavenly Father's relationship to us. He's constant when we are not. He's loving when we are not. He's available when we are not. He is strong and courageous when we are not. Relationship is. Christ's relationship to us is. It doesn't change when we change. And so we have these ideas, again, of a non-contingent relationship, of a deep commitment, and of humble recognition. Our children, like our legacy, they belong to God. I thought I was a great parent with my first son. I really did. It turns out that he was just very easy compared to the rest. Humility is key. We do our best, we do our very best, and then we leave the results in the hands of God. This is a concept, visional ethics, which I want to introduce you to. It's had a very profound impact on my life, and it is this. It's the ability to see beyond the present and appreciate the unfolding work of God in the life of another. This is visional ethics. Stanley Hauerwas is an ethicist at Duke University. He wrote about this concept in the 1970s. He is a believer. And essentially what he's suggesting is that we see what is going to be, not only what is. I sat at the breakfast table with Tess, this is about 6 months ago, and I said, I want you to tell me something about this flower that's on the table. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to tell me what it is in the future. And Tess said, Daddy, I see a field of flowers. And she's right. That flower is not one flower, it's a field of flowers. If you can see the future, if you can connect the end from the beginning, see the end from the beginning, you can understand what visional ethics is. The reason why Luther would suggest that tomorrow I'm going to plant a tree if I think the Lord is coming back soon is because he still sees the value not only in the future, but he has a vision not only of a world full of saplings, but a world full of majestic oaks. Tess's field of flowers captures what visional ethics is. Can you see in someone else the potential, all that God created them to be, all that God created them to be, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and live into that and treat them not as if they are who they are today, but who they will be. My experience of visional ethics when I was 14 or 15 years old was not on the conceptual side. It was one man who didn't treat me like the little skateboarding punk that I was. He treated me like I was a 25-year-old adult. He talked to me like I was a 25-year-old adult. He didn't see a boy dressed in black with long bangs and full of anger and resentment. Maybe he did see those things, but my experience was that they were ignored completely, and he treated me as if I was someone who was arriving on time as opposed to late and completely off the tracks. I think that he saw beyond the present, and I think that he was a man living in faith, looking at an unfolding work of God in the life of another. And I think visional ethics is something that if we apply to our children, if we apply to our grandchildren, I think the crisis of the moment, the crisis of the day, becomes much less significant. And there is, I don't know exactly how this works metaphysically, but there is something that is almost gap-filling in that regards. That vision, that hope, that reality, the vision of what could be and what will be, I think fills gaps. I mentioned yesterday that if you wanted to get a hard copy of the book, what I'd love to do is send you that hard copy. Please give me a review. I don't. This is a work in process. This book, Intentional Families, 10 chapters are complete. I'm editing the last 9, and I actually have finished all 10. The editor wrote me a very kind note saying, "Have you considered restructuring the whole book?" I thought it was done. So I would appreciate your comments and feedback as we move towards the final production of that. And it'll be out, I think, within the next 90 days. But stop by the booth. If you haven't filled out that card, they'll give you that pre-publication sample. We talked about accounting for what you've received. The reality is that many of us in our lives, what we received in terms of legacy was baggage. It was burdensome. It was painful. It was a void, whether it was love and affirmation that was missing. But you need to understand how that has shaped you. You need to understand how that has played a part in your life, lest that legacy baggage be carried from previous generations through your own life into the next generation. You can perpetuate, like the scratch in a record, something that comes around and continues to come around and is felt by everyone. What should you do? You should take an account of it. You should learn everything that you can from it, and you should choose to set a new course, leaving the baggage behind. I'm not a psychologist. Maybe a psychologist would say that's trite, that's simple, that's impossible. But I think the first thing to do is identify, in a full accounting of what you've received, so that you know what needs to be put in motion for future generations. We mentioned disturbance. Lawrence Gonzalez wrote a book called Deep Survival. And in the book, he describes the attitudes and the dispositions of people who come into crisis situations and live, and crisis situations, people who don't make it through. And he develops a psychological profile. He's not a believer, but I think there's some interesting insights in terms of this psychological profile, the attitude and the mindset of people who respond to disturbance or crisis and are incapacitated by it, and those who take it in stride and ask the question, well, what do we do next? We've got to do something. What do we do next? Crisis is opportunity in disguise. Crisis is opportunity in disguise, particularly if your family has included in it an ethic of redemption. An ethic of redemption. How do you anticipate crisis? How do you prepare for it? I think this is also something that is determined very intentionally within your family before you get there. It's ideal to train for how you are going to behave in the context of real pressure. Family culture, when you look at the importance of family culture to future generations, we're talking about the storytelling that occurs, where everyone understands who Grandma and Grandpa were. Everyone understands where they fit in a lineage, where they received this particular insight in terms of spiritual blessing or intellectual or cultural blessing. From beginning to end, I'm making a very simple assumption, and that is that as a family, you spend time together. I'm not even addressing it because I just assume that whether it's breakfast or dinner or the holidays, that you are very deliberate about the time that you spend together. Relationship requires it. Relationship requires time spent. You can try to argue for quality over quantity. And I think as children get older and move into adulthood, that qualitative over quantitative time probably matters. But I can tell you the primary dysfunction within our family as I grew up was from a lack of quantity, not lack of quality. I always had quality time with my parents. But in those critical moments when I was on the ice rink playing a game and I saw all the other dads in the stands, my dad was traveling. 75% of the time he was traveling. The dysfunction within our family has to do with a family culture that did not cultivate the time spent necessary for critical conversations to occur. Now, that was in the early days of our business. As the business matured, our family culture took on a very different tone, and we were able to do more of those things. But quite frankly, there was a mark that had already been left from that. Your family culture is very important. What are the things that you celebrate? What are the things that you remember? What are the things that you honor? We celebrate some really silly things in our family. I've got 4 kids, and I can't tell you the number of times we end up with a skinned knee in a week. We celebrate injuries. Every time somebody skins a knee, there is either a toast at the dinner table or a special cookie or scoop of ice cream, and everybody comes to the dinner table ready to tell about their war wounds for the day. And it's an exciting moment, because when you watch them run around the yard and tumble head over heel and get back up, the first thing that they look for is the audience to say, we've got something to celebrate. We're looking for ways to honor future generations. We're looking for ways to honor past generations. We're looking for ways to remember the lessons that we've learned as a family, the things that were hard fought by my father. I am so glad to be a second generation business manager, because I know that the stress and the strain that he went through in starting our business, dealing with imminent failure every day for years, was a pressure and a stress and a strain that I do not bear. And I'm grateful for it. And a part of our family culture is making sure that my children know what went into starting our company in 1972. What those early years looked like. What Molly and Don were committed to, what they sacrificed for, and what we should be grateful for as a family. Gratefulness, thanksgiving within a second and third generation is very important. That family culture of tying together what it is you're grateful for and thankful for is absolutely critical, and it has to happen. Financial legacy it's an interesting part of the book. It's only 1 chapter, because to me there is so many other elements of a family legacy, and the financial piece can really be simply broken down into one of 2 categories. Have you put in the hard structures necessary to be tax efficient and legally precise? So you're talking about getting together with a lawyer and a tax attorney and doing proper hard structure planning. That's not this book, and that's not my heart. My heart is to look at the soft structures, the things that go into the creation of the ethos of the family, the culture, the values, the priorities, the vision that you cast for your own life, for the generation that you're directly responsible for, and for all future generations. Now, the reality is your vision is not perfect. What you received is not perfect. What you pass along will not be perfect, but hopefully you have equipped them with the tools to take that vision and make it better. My lessons were very simple. Lessons of a prodigal. I experienced grace. I experienced visional ethics. I experienced through decades of working with my father, restorative dialogue, forgiving and being forgiven. And in the end, life, like investments, is fraught with risks. You can make a lot of mistakes financially. You can make a lot of mistakes in your parenting. But even those mistakes can become assets for you when grace replaces being right. And redemption is the fundamental ethic of your family. When I look at the macro issues of our day, I can be overwhelmed. There are many things that don't have public policy solutions, and I think we'll continue to see a punting into the future, kicking of the can down the road. What we have as an opportunity is to shape microcultures, and in aggregate, our microcultures shape macrocultures and change the issues of our day which seem so overwhelming. If you take seriously the decisions that you make in terms of the design and function of your family, if you reverse engineer and take your highest ideals and backtrack from what is possible in keeping with God's design, you're created in the image of God. What are your capacities? Are you moving towards those capacities every day in small incremental steps? That vision, prayerfully cast for your family, I think solves many of the macro issues. It may be a 20 or 30 or 40-year project, but again, as Luther said, if Jesus is coming back tomorrow, I'm going to plant my tree today. Thank you very much. The heart of each individual in the family, the heart of the family itself, when you tend to those things, it opens the door for a much broader treatment of family legacy, and I think that's sorely needed. We see wealth management as the management of a single resource, with many more in a successful legacy plan being treated very, very carefully. So a wider range of resources is what I'm suggesting has to be stewarded. Our lives do touch at least 4 generations. You have multi-generational inputs. Grandparents are very significant. Great-grandparents are very significant. And there's 2 aspects to this. There is the presence aspect. Presence is very impactful. Your presence in someone's life is very, very important. But your absence is impactful as well. It was Paul Vitz, a Christian psychologist at New York University, who has written a case for the absence of fathers or a father substitute as being the critical element in the lives of your most prominent atheists. My point is that absence of any generation leaves its mark. One generation can set in motion our week, and there's very little time to stop and reflect. And I think that what we lose in that is something very, very significant, and the consequences are very, very severe. In the olden days, you had the peripatetic life, the walkabout life. You walked everywhere. And there was a lot of time to think and reflect and listen. And I think that what we have today, instead of the peripatetic life, is the modern day hectic life. And we go and we go and we go, and then we collapse at the end of the day and are grateful for all the things that were done, but very rarely are those thin spaces in time where we rest, where we listen, where we dream. And I think this is where we also fail to see what is possible in terms of God's shaping all of the potentialities that he's given us. In other words, there's no time to see the future. I had an interesting conversation with Dr. William Welty last night, and it was a good reminder that Luther said, if the Lord's coming back tomorrow, I'm going to plant a tree in the morning. And there's this idea that there is the tomorrows that we don't know of yet, and we live into those. And I think that's very important. Good morning. It's good to be with you again. Yesterday, we talked about macro level issues, and this is going to be a big shift to the micro. And I think that this is where we build our legacies. This is where we can have the greatest impact if you're talking about a social, political, cultural, spiritual impact. It is in the minutia of our life, the details, the things that we put in motion every day that, again, as I suggested yesterday, in aggregate, make for the building of our legacy. I want to suggest also that there is something that stands in the way of that in our very busy lives, and that is what some have described as the tyranny of the urgent. We have so many things that fill every minute of our day. Every day of our, as you cast a vision for your children, for your grandchildren, of what life is, of what an abundant life is here and now. So The Intentional Family is the title of my book, Reverse Engineering a Legacy from Finish to Start. It's also our topic today. And I have to be honest, I don't know that I'm qualified for this particular topic. The things that I think might have some bearing on speaking to being intentional and raising a family and reverse engineering a legacy. I am a son. I'm also a father. I knew one of my grandfathers. We probably spent time together a maximum of 6 times in my life. I have children, and I can imagine the future. And these are things that, prayerfully considered, I think go into ultimately creating a context that is soul transforming, life transforming, full of vision, and inspirational to my children as giving them a redemptive hope and a view to a joyful life. And again, I hope that this is something that is vision cast for future generations of McAlvanys. David Mitchell says, "Our lives are not our own. We are bound to others, past and present, and by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future." Which is to suggest that our choices are not made in a vacuum, and they directly impact not only our lives, but all of the lives around us. Jeremiah says in chapter 10, verse 23, "Lord, I know that people's lives are not their own." How we live our lives is either a blessing to others in terms of the legacy blessing that it creates, or it just adds burdensome baggage that they carry, that we carry. In other words, our choices have implications into the future. So after 2 generations and a combined 50 years, a half century in the business of wealth management, there are some lessons that I think are crystal clear. 50 years and thousands of families that I've watched my father consult with, that I've consulted with, and I'll tell you, only on rare occasions are resources stewarded well intergenerationally. Money is more often than not a source of conflict, in part, I suppose, because the most neglected resource is to the outsider fairly obvious. It's the heart.